He came from a lie, wrapped in cloth, mistaken for a stone. While one world collapsed beneath cruelty, another stirred in the shadows. Born last, fated to be first, he would one day unseat time itself. This is not a tale of gentle heroes. This is a saga of storms, of a child born to a mother with no more tears, and a father with no more mercy. The skies were not his gift, they were his conquest. His siblings waited in darkness. His enemies ruled from above. But in the silence of Crete's caves, the wind began to shift. And when he rose like thunder. Swift, merciless, unstoppable. He didn't just end an age. He forged a new one. The sky would never be the same. This is the story of the one who dared to change everything. Before thunder ruled the skies, the world was ruled by fear, prophecy, and the silence of swallowed gods. In the beginning, there was neither light nor darkness, neither earth nor heaven, neither time nor space, only the yawning void that primordial peoples called chaos. This was not the chaos of destruction that mortals would later know, but something far more profound. The absolute emptiness from which all existence would emerge, the pregnant silence that contained every possibility yet to be born. From this formless vastness, the first powers stirred into being, like thoughts taking shape in a dreaming mind. Gaia arose, the earth herself, vast and fertile beyond mortal comprehension. Her body became the foundation of all that would follow, mountains rising like the curve of her spine, valleys cradling her gentle breath, rivers flowing like veins beneath her skin. She was not merely goddess of the earth, but the earth itself, living awareness that would one day whisper through cave winds and oracle springs. Tartarus emerged from the depths, that dreadful abyss that would one day imprison the defeated and echo with the lamentations of the damned. Where Gaia represented life and fertility, Tartarus embodied the absolute limits that even celestial might could not transgress. With them came Eros, not the cherubic figure of later art, but the fundamental force that binds all things together, the attraction that makes creation possible, rather than allowing everything to drift apart into meaningless isolation. Gaia gazed upward into the star-scattered darkness and felt the loneliness that drives all creation. From her yearning, she called forth Uranus, the sky himself, immense and bronze-domed, stretching from horizon to horizon, like a celestial ceiling, studded with silver fire. Uranus descended to embrace his earthly bride, his star crown touching her mountain peaks, and from their union came the first generation of children who would shape the world's destiny. The Titans emerged in an age when the boundaries between godly and natural, between conscious will and elemental force, remained fluid. These were not gods, as later generations would understand them, but embodiments of the raw forces that moved through creation. Oceanus, whose streams would one day circle the earth. Hyperion, who would sire the sun and moon. Iapetus, Creus, Coeus, and Themis, each a fundamental principle given awareness and form. Among them, born under the most favorable alignments of newly created stars, came Cronus, whose very name carried whispers of time's cruel passage and change's inexorable authority. As each mighty child emerged from Gaia's womb, Uranus felt not the joy that should accompany new life, but a terror that gnawed at his immortal essence like acid. These offspring possessed strength that rivaled his own. Might that could challenge his supremacy, potential that threatened the order he had established. The Cyclopes followed, one-eyed giants whose single orbs burned with forge fire, whose massive hands would one day craft weapons capable of shaking the foundations of heaven itself. Then came the Hekatoncheires, 100-handed, 50-headed monstrosities, whose very existence challenged every notion of natural order and celestial beauty. With each new arrival, Uranus's paranoia deepened into madness. These were not merely children, but potential usurpers, each one capable of overthrowing the order he had established. His decision, when it finally came, was as brutal as it was decisive. As each child emerged from Gaia's womb, crying with voices that would one day command stars and storms, Uranus seized them with hands that could span continents and thrust them back into the Earth's depths. Not death, for these beings were immortal, but imprisonment more dreadful than any grave. Buried alive in the darkness beneath the world's foundations, they clawed at stone walls that would not yield, screamed through miles of rock that muffled their voices, and raged against the patriarch who had chosen his own security over their freedom. Gaia's agony transcended anything mortal mothers could comprehend. Her children, imprisoned within her own body, sent constant reminders of their suffering through every earthquake that split her surface, every volcanic eruption that voiced their rage, every underground river that carried their tears to distant seas. The weight of their despair pressed down upon her awareness like a physical burden. For ages beyond counting, this family maintained its nightmare equilibrium, Uranus ruling the heavens in paranoid isolation, Gaia suffering beneath the weight of her imprisoned children, and the Titans plotting revenge in their underground prison. The universe held its breath, waiting for the moment when this unnatural arrangement would finally shatter. The rebellion, when it came, emerged from the depths, like a long-buried earthquake finally breaking free. Gaia could no longer endure the suffering of her children or the oppression of her mate. In the secret places beneath the world, where neither starlight nor celestial surveillance could penetrate, she forged a weapon from the hardest substances in creation, a sickle of adamant that could cut through immortal flesh as easily as mortals harvest grain. Her choice of champion revealed strategic wisdom that would echo through every subsequent generation. Not the eldest or strongest of her imprisoned sons, but Cronus, the one whose nature embodied time itself, whose very existence represented the principle that all things must change, that no reign lasts forever. Your sire has made us all prisoners in our own realm, Gaia whispered to her son as she placed the fearsome weapon in his hands. But you, my child, carry within yourself the strength that destroys all despotism, the passage of time that makes every king mortal, every empire temporary, every age a prelude to transformation. The night chosen for the deed possessed an ominous quality that later generations would associate with the most significant moments in immortal history. When Uranus descended to embrace his earthly bride, he found not the submissive partner he expected, but the instrument of justice he had long feared. Cronus struck with the precision that comes from righteous anger, combined with perfect timing. The adamant sickle bit deep into celestial flesh, and Uranus's sacred blood fell like a meteor shower, each drop carrying the potential for new life and new horror. Where his essence touched the sea, foam arose and swirled in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. From that foam would one day emerge Aphrodite, goddess of love, born from an act of violence. The castration of Uranus marked more than a change in rulership. It represented the first great transformation in the nature of immortal authority itself. The Sky Father's withdrawal to the uttermost reaches of the heavens left behind a vacuum that younger forces could fill, while his parting words carried the weight of inescapable prophecy. As you have overthrown me, my son, Uranus declared as his wounded form retreated beyond the reach of earthly powers, so shall you be overthrown by your own child. The pattern is set in the very structure of time itself. The wheel will turn, the seasons will change, and what rises must eventually fall. I curse you with the knowledge of your own inevitable defeat." These words embedded themselves in Cronus's mind, like splinters of poisoned glass, impossible to remove and destined to fester with each passing eon. He had won the universe through violence, and violence would one day claim him in return. Free at last from their underground prison, the Titans emerged to acclaim their brother's victory, while the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires withdrew to the depths where they could nurse their wounds and perfect their hatred of celestial authority. The world trembled as these mighty beings took their places in the new order, each claiming dominion over aspects of creation that would become their eternal provinces. Cronus assumed the throne of the universe with full knowledge that his victory was temporary, his reign destined to end in defeat and exile. This awareness of inevitable doom shaped every decision he made as ruler of the Golden Age. Where Uranus had ruled through ignorant paranoia, Cronus would govern through the dreadful wisdom of absolute foreknowledge about his own fate. The Golden Age that followed represented the pinnacle of celestial civilization, a time when the boundary between gods and mortals remained permeable, when the earth gave freely of her bounty without requiring the labor that would later define human existence. Men lived like gods in those days, free from toil and suffering, aging slowly if at all. Yet beneath this apparent perfection, the seeds of future conflict were already germinating. Cronus ruled wisely, but lived in constant fear, his perception dominated by his ancestors' prediction. When he took his sister, Rhea, as his queen, their union represented the inevitable convergence of forces that would produce the next great transformation. Rhea possessed beauty that transcended physical appearance, embodying the fertile principle that makes all growth and change possible. Her presence brought abundance to whatever realms she touched, while her gentle wisdom provided balance to Cronus's increasingly suspicious governance. When she announced that she carried their first child, the moment marked both the culmination of their happiness and the beginning of tragedy. The birth of Hestia should have been a celebration that united the immortal court in joy. Instead, it became the first act in a drama that would rival any mortal tragedy. The infant goddess, born with tiny fingers that reached toward flame as if recognizing her future domain, represented everything the ancient king cherished most. His wife's love made manifest, the continuation of his celestial line. Yet when he looked into his daughter's face, the Lord of the First Age saw no innocence, only the shadow of rebellion, not joy, but the spark of the downfall he feared. The paranoia that had consumed his progenitor now claimed him as well, transforming paternal love into existential dread. Without pause, without pity, without a flicker of guilt, the Titan King opened his eternal jaws and consumed his daughter whole. Hestia disappeared into the darkness of her sire's stomach, not dead, but not truly alive, existing in suspended animation that preserved her godly essence while denying her any possibility of growth. Rhea's screams of horror and anguish echoed through dimensions that had never known such profound violation of natural order. The mother's grief at witnessing her child's consumption created the first cracks in the Golden Age's perfect facade. "What have you done?" Rhea demanded, but her husband's response revealed the depths of his transformation, from liberator to despot. "What I must do," Cronus replied with the cold logic of absolute desperation. "What was done to me, I do to them. My ancestor buried his children in the earth's depths, but I have found a more secure prison. They will remain safe within me, unable to grow strong enough to challenge my supremacy, unable to fulfill the prediction that promises my defeat." The pattern established with Hestia's consumption repeated itself with each subsequent birth. Demeter emerged beautiful and laughing, her infant presence causing flowers to bloom in winter snow, but she too vanished into her progenitor's maw. Hera followed, born with eyes that held the wisdom of queens, yet she joined her sisters in the fearsome prison of the ancient tyrant's stomach. Hades arrived carrying the scent of deep places and the ability to quiet storms with his touch, but his gentle nature provided no protection against his patriarch's paranoid hunger. Poseidon's birth brought the smell of ocean spray and the sound of distant waves, yet he too disappeared into the darkness. 5 children of immense potency existed in a state neither living nor dead, waiting in the timeless void for deliverance that seemed impossible. With each act of filicide, Cronus convinced himself that he was preserving order and preventing the chaos that would surely follow his own overthrow. Yet each child's consumption also drove him further into the madness that makes autocrats ultimately self-destructive. Rhea's grief had crystallized into something harder than diamond and more enduring than the mountains themselves. When she felt the 6th child quickening within her womb, she knew with absolute certainty that she could not endure watching another of her offspring disappear into that maw. The choice she faced transcended simple maternal instinct. It represented the decision between accepting eternal oppression and taking the desperate gamble that might restore justice. Her flight to Crete occurred under cover of darkness that seemed deeper than natural night, as if the very heavens conspired to hide her from her husband's surveillance. The island's wild mountains provided sanctuary where even godly sight could not penetrate, while its caves offered hiding places that had existed since the world's foundation. Here, attended by nymphs whose loyalty to the Earth Mother transcended their fear of the Sky King's wrath, Rhea prepared to give birth to the child who would either save or damn them all. The moment of Zeus's birth was marked by portents that announced the arrival of a force greater than any the world had yet seen. Thunder rolled across clear skies while lightning illuminated clouds that had appeared from nowhere. The very air seemed to crackle with potential energy, as if the atmosphere itself recognized that something unprecedented was entering the world. "Zeus," Rhea whispered to her newborn son as she cradled him against her breast, feeling the electric tingle that accompanied contact with his infant form. "Your name is Zeus, and you will be the storm that breaks your ancestors' reign, the lightning that splits the darkness of oppression, the thunder that announces justice's return to the world." Even as Rhea voiced those hopeful words about destiny, she knew deep down that keeping her son alive meant resorting to a lie that went against everything she felt as a mother. To care for him directly was too great a risk. The Father of Time would have noticed the slightest change in her behavior. Instead, she must return to her husband empty-handed, trusting others to nurture the child who carried the universe's future in his tiny hands. The nymphs who agreed to serve as Zeus's foster mothers understood the significance of their task. Adrasteia and Ida became the infant god's primary caregivers, providing the maternal love that Rhea could not openly express, while teaching him the lessons he would need to survive in a world governed by a paranoid dictator who feared his own children above all other threats. Amalthea, the sacred goat whose milk would nourish the future king of the gods, gave of herself with perfect generosity. Her milk possessed properties that no mortal sustenance could match, containing within it the essence of immortal vitality itself. With every feeding, the infant grew stronger, wiser, and more prepared for the fate that lay ahead. The curates, long devoted to sacred rituals, used wild dancing and clanging bronze to mask the child's presence, becoming his fierce, self-declared protectors. Whenever the infant cried, they surrounded the cave entrance with their frenzied dancing, drowning out his voice with the clash of metal on metal and wild shouts that proclaimed their devotion to the hidden god. Meanwhile, Rhea's desperate subterfuge required acting skills that would have impressed the greatest performers. She wrapped a large stone in swaddling clothes, holding it as tenderly as she would have held her actual child. When she presented this bundle to her husband, her performance was so convincing that Cronus never suspected the deception that would ultimately doom his reign. The sovereign of the First Age gave it no thought. He grabbed the bundle and swallowed it down, the stone sinking among the divine lives he had already trapped within himself. The weight provided reassurance that once again he had cheated fate and secured his throne against the next generation's inevitable challenge. In the shadowed heart of a Cretan cave, the boy's extraordinary life among immortals began to unfold. Unlike other gods who had emerged fully formed, he experienced genuine development that paralleled mortal growth while transcending every human limitation. His infant laughter caused storm clouds to gather, merely to witness what could bring such joy, while his tears fell as gentle rain that nourished the island's growing things. As the divine child matured, his foster mothers shared the old stories, ones that slowly revealed his place in the world and the path ahead. They spoke of his imprisoned siblings, his progenitor's tyranny, his mother's sacrifice, and the divination that promised liberation for all who suffered under the Father of Time's paranoid rule. The strength that manifested around Zeus as he matured defied every precedent in celestial development. Lightning played around his fingers like tame pets, while thunder provided percussion for his childhood games. Eagles, recognizing some instinctive kinship with the Lord of the Sky, came to perch near the cave entrance like an honor guard, acknowledging their future king. What stood out most, even from childhood, was his deep-rooted sense of justice. Where his grandfather had governed with selfish suspicion and his father with fearful tyranny, the boy instinctively leaned toward balance and fairness, traits that would later define his role as judge among gods and humans alike. The education Zeus received encompassed more than mere survival skills. The nymphs taught him statecraft and justice, philosophy and poetry, the arts of war and the principles of peace. Most importantly, they helped him understand that true kingship meant service to others rather than domination over them, that real authority came from earning loyalty rather than inspiring fear. As he neared his divine coming of age, the land surrounding the cave seemed to echo the rise of his power. Storms gathered more frequently over the island, but they were storms of purpose rather than random violence. The thunder that accompanied these weather patterns carried messages that only other gods could interpret, while the lightning illuminated scenes of future triumph. The moment finally arrived when Zeus could no longer remain hidden from the world that awaited his intervention. Standing at the cave mouth where he had spent his formative years, he gazed out at a universe ruled by the ancestor who had tried to devour him. The young god's features had acquired the noble bearing that would one day command respect from every celestial and mortal being, while his eyes held the fierce blue of storm-torn skies and the unwavering determination of absolute justice. Hiding was no longer an option. What the sovereign of the First Age had feared most was now at hand. Not a petty rebellion, but the birth of a new power, one set on building unshakable order. Zeus stepped out of the cave and into his destiny, ready to challenge the dictator who ruled the universe and to free the siblings who had waited so long for liberation. His emergence from the shadows came with lightning that lit the Mediterranean sky, and thunder that followed, echoing a warning to every immortal that the world was about to shift. Cronus felt that sound in his bones and knew, with the dreadful certainty that only prophecy can provide, that his time as ruler was rapidly approaching its end. The children of the gods waited in secret beneath the earth, while in the caves of Crete, a silent thunder marked the stirring of what was to come. But silence, like all things, must eventually break. And when it did, the very universe would tremble under the force of the storm that would remake the world according to the will of Zeus, king of the gods and lord of justice, whose thunder would echo through eternity as the voice of celestial law itself. The sky wasn't passed down to him. He earned it through fire, through blood, and through a war that lit the stars. Emerging from his Cretan sanctuary with lightning crackling around his form like a living crown, the young god surveyed a cosmos ruled by fear and governed by the very tyranny he had been born to overthrow. His first breath of free air carried the scent of rebellion, while his first steps toward destiny left thunderous echoes that would reshape the foundations of existence itself. Among the scattered islands of the Aegean, word spread through networks of nymphs and minor deities that something unprecedented was stirring. Shepherds reported strange lights dancing across mountain peaks during cloudless nights, while fishermen spoke of waters that glowed with phosphorescent fire whenever storms approached their vessels. These phenomena marked the passage of a god whose very presence charged the atmosphere with revolutionary potential, whose journey toward confrontation with established authority left traces that mortals would interpret as omens for generations to come. Considering the magnitude of his intended rebellion, Zeus understood that direct assault against Cronus would prove futile without allies who possessed both the motivation to fight and the strength to prevail. His siblings, imprisoned within their sire's stomach for countless eons, represented the most natural coalition partners, if they could be liberated from their terrible captivity. Yet freeing them would require cunning that matched his growing might, strategy that could overcome the paranoid vigilance of a ruler who had maintained supremacy through systematic elimination of all potential threats. Metis emerged as Zeus's first and most crucial ally, though her support came at a price that would echo through eternity. This titaness of wisdom and deep thought possessed knowledge that transcended mere cleverness, understanding the hidden connections between cause and effect that governed both mortal affairs and celestial politics. Her advice would prove invaluable in the coming struggle, yet her eventual fate would demonstrate that even the wisest counselors could not foresee every consequence of their guidance. Approach your father not as a conqueror, but as a dutiful son, Metis counseled, her eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom of ages. Offer him a drink that honors his reign and celebrates his continued vigilance against the threats that surround his throne. Within that cup, I shall place substances that will compel his body to surrender what it has wrongfully consumed. Guided by her wisdom, he set in motion a deception as audacious as it was brilliant, slipping into the role of a humble servant, a move that both stroked Cronus's vanity and masked his true intent. He handed his father wine laced with herbs of unimaginable potency. Mustard and salt, combined with other ingredients whose names were known only to the wisest among the Titans, created a concoction that would reverse years of systematic infanticide. Cronus drank deeply, savoring what he believed was tribute from a loyal servant, while remaining completely unaware that his own son stood before him. Within moments, the mixture began its work, causing violent convulsions that racked his immortal frame with agony beyond description. Yet this physical suffering paled beside the psychological horror of watching his carefully constructed security crumble as, one by one, his swallowed children emerged from the depths of his digestive tract. Poseidon appeared first, his hair streaming with ethereal waters, and his eyes blazing with the fury of one who had been denied his rightful place in creation's hierarchy. Hades followed, bringing with him the chill of underground places and the terrible patience of those who understand that all debts must eventually be paid. Hera's emergence marked the return of regal authority to the world, while Demeter brought with her the promise of abundance that had been missing from the earth throughout the years of her captivity. Hestia, the eldest and first consumed, stepped forth last, her quiet dignity providing stark contrast to the violent circumstances of her liberation. Each sibling bore the marks of their long imprisonment, not physical scars, for divine flesh cannot be permanently damaged, but spiritual wounds that would influence their personalities and relationships throughout the eons to come. Their gratitude towards Zeus was matched only by their burning desire for vengeance against the father who had robbed them of their rightful places in the cosmic order. Standing together for the first time since their births, the 6 children of Cronus and Rhea represented a concentration of power unlike anything the universe had previously witnessed. Each possessed abilities that complemented those of their siblings, creating possibilities for cooperation and combined action that their father's systematic isolation had been designed to prevent. Zeus naturally assumed leadership of this nascent coalition, his role as liberator establishing precedents that would govern their relationships throughout eternity. Cronus, weakened by the violent purging that had emptied his stomach of its divine contents, nonetheless retained formidable capabilities that made immediate victory impossible. His mastery over time itself provided advantages that no purely physical strength could overcome, while his centuries of rule had established networks of loyalty among powers who owed their positions to his patronage. Most significantly, he could call upon his fellow Titans, brothers and sisters, whose opposition to the younger generation reflected both family solidarity and reasonable fear about their own futures under different leadership. Across the cosmos, battle lines began forming as word of Zeus's revolt spread among immortal powers, who now faced the necessity of choosing sides in a conflict that would determine the universe's future governance. Oceanus, whose rivers encircled the world, wavered between loyalty to his brother Cronus and recognition that change might bring opportunities for expanded influence. Hyperion, father of the sun and moon, saw in the struggle a chance to establish his offspring as central figures in whatever order emerged from the chaos. During this period of growing tension, both sides engaged in diplomatic efforts designed to secure crucial allies, while denying support to their enemies. He sent envoys to the undecided powers, offering them greater status and wider realms in return for their swords. Cronus countered with reminders of past favors and warnings about the dangers of supporting untested leadership, whose inexperience might lead to cosmic catastrophe. Some of the first and most devoted allies were the nymphs and nature spirits who had watched him grow in secret on Crete and come to trust his nature. These beings, while individually weak compared to the major powers, collectively possessed knowledge of secret paths and hidden resources that would prove invaluable during the prolonged conflict ahead. Their support also provided moral legitimacy for the rebellion, demonstrating that Zeus fought not merely for personal aggrandizement, but for justice that would benefit all of creation's children. Rhea found herself torn between competing loyalties that reflected the fundamental tragedy of their family situation. As the mother of him and his siblings, she stood firmly by their side, rejoicing in their release from a fate that had never been meant for them. Yet as wife to Cronus, she retained affection for the mate who had shared with her the joys of the Golden Age, before paranoia transformed him into the monster who devoured his own offspring. Her eventual decision to support her children rather than her husband marked another crucial step in the rebellion's development. Military preparations began in earnest as both sides recognized that diplomatic solutions to their conflict were impossible. He chose Mount Olympus as his stronghold, the great mountain whose soaring heights brought it nearest to the realm of the heavens. From this strategic position, he could observe enemy movements while providing a defensible position that showcased his control over storms and weather patterns. The mountain's selection as rebel headquarters also carried symbolic significance, representing the young god's intention to establish a new order that would literally rise above the old. Cronus responded by fortifying Mount Othrys, the traditional stronghold of titanic power that had served as the center of governance throughout his reign. This ancient citadel possessed defenses that had been perfected over cosmic ages, while its position commanded crucial passages that connected different regions of the immortal realm. From Othrys, the established ruler could coordinate resistance to rebellion, while drawing upon resources accumulated during his long period of supremacy. Between these opposing strongholds lay territories that would become battlefields where the fate of cosmic governance would be decided through violence that surpassed anything in previous experience. Mountains were moved as projectiles, rivers diverted to flood enemy positions, and storms summoned to confuse opposing forces. The scale of destruction exceeded mortal comprehension, yet both sides understood that victory would justify any cost, while defeat would mean either eternal imprisonment or complete annihilation. As the coming war loomed larger than any before, he understood that his alliance needed weapons powerful enough to counter the Titan's deep-rooted strength and seasoned command. Conventional arms, however skillfully crafted, would prove inadequate against enemies who had mastered the fundamental forces of nature throughout centuries of rule. Victory would demand innovations that surpassed existing military technology, while exploiting the specific weaknesses that careful analysis revealed in titanic defenses. Deep within the Earth's foundations, the Cyclops had spent their years of imprisonment perfecting their legendary skills in metalworking and engineering. These one-eyed giants, originally cast into Tartarus by Uranus and later ignored by Cronus, possessed knowledge of forging techniques that could create items of power beyond ordinary imagination. Their liberation from captivity became Zeus's first priority once active hostilities commenced, both for the weapons they could provide and for the symbolic value of reversing another of his ancestors' injustices. Descending into the hellish depths where the Cyclopes had endured their captivity required courage that even divine nature could barely provide. Tartarus itself seemed to resist intrusion, its darkness pressing against intruders, with weight that threatened to crush even immortal bodies, while its silence carried undertones of madness that could destroy unprepared minds. Yet Zeus pressed forward, guided by determination that transcended mere physical bravery, and drew strength from his conviction that justice demanded the liberation of all who suffered under tyrannical oppression. Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, the three Cyclopes whose names meant thunder, lightning, and bright, greeted their liberator with gratitude that encompassed both personal freedom and recognition that their skills would finally receive the appreciation they deserved. Centuries of imprisonment had only refined their abilities, while their desire for revenge against the powers that had condemned them to isolation provided motivation that guaranteed their wholehearted support for Zeus's cause. Working with metals that existed nowhere else in creation, and employing techniques that mortal smiths could never comprehend, the Cyclopes forged weapons that would tip the balance of cosmic warfare. For him, they forged the Thunderbolt, not just a weapon, but a symbol of divine command, able to level foes while declaring its bearer's rule over the skies. Each bolt crackled with power that could split mountains or level cities, yet its true significance lay in the symbolic statement it made about the young god's fitness to rule. Poseidon received the trident, a three-pronged instrument that granted mastery over all waters, while providing the ability to generate earthquakes that could topple the mightiest fortifications. With this weapon, the sea god could summon tidal waves that would sweep away entire armies, or create whirlpools that would drag enemy vessels into oceanic depths from which no escape was possible. The trident's power complemented its wielder's natural affinity for aquatic environments, while extending his influence over terrestrial domains that would prove crucial in the coming war. For Hades, the craftsman created a helmet of invisibility that would allow its wearer to move unseen through enemy territory, while gathering intelligence that conventional reconnaissance could never obtain. This cap of darkness, forged from metals that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, represented more than mere camouflage. It embodied the principle that knowledge obtained through stealth could prove more valuable than strength displayed through open confrontation. Armed with these legendary weapons and supported by growing numbers of allies who recognized the justice of their cause, Zeus's coalition began the systematic campaign that would determine cosmic governance for ages to come. Yet even with their newfound advantages, the rebels faced enemies whose experience and established resources made victory far from certain. His dominion extended beyond the Titans themselves. Under the Father of Time's leadership stood many lesser powers, bound to him by consistent leadership and thoughtful reward. Opening phases of what would become known as the Titanomachy saw both sides testing their opponent's capabilities while seeking weaknesses that could be exploited in decisive engagements. He began testing the edges of Titanic territory, unleashing lightning forged by the Cyclopes to show its devastating power, while quietly assessing enemy defenses. The sovereign of the First Age retaliated by distorting time's rhythm, casting his challenger into a haze of delayed movement and dulled senses, proof that experience still held power over invention. Casualties in these early encounters shocked both sides with their severity and permanence. Unlike mortal conflicts, where death provided natural limits to destruction, divine warfare continued until one side achieved total victory or complete defeat. Wounds that would have been minor inconveniences in normal circumstances became crippling disadvantages that influenced the course of entire battles, while strategic positions lost during moments of carelessness could not be recovered without enormous sacrifice. Escalation seemed inevitable as minor skirmishes evolved into major engagements that drew increasing numbers of combatants into conflicts that had originally involved only the primary antagonists. Allied powers found themselves compelled to provide ever greater support to their chosen sides, while neutral parties discovered that maintaining independence became impossible, as the war's expansion made fence-sitting politically and physically dangerous. Towering above his kin in brute strength, Atlas led the charge for the Lord of the First Age, his relentless attacks shaking the battlefield and defying even the might of divine lightning. This giant's ability to bear any weight made conventional weapons ineffective against him, while his strategic intelligence enabled him to coordinate complex operations that maximized Titanic advantages while minimizing their vulnerabilities. Though born of the Titans, Prometheus ultimately sided with the opposition, having weighed the values and futures of both camps. His gift of foresight revealed probable futures that influenced his decision to align with forces of change rather than defending established order, though his support came with conditions that reflected his independent nature rather than blind loyalty to any authority. Years passed as the conflict raged across cosmic battlefields where victory seemed as distant as ever. Both sides had won significant engagements and suffered devastating defeats, yet neither had achieved the decisive breakthrough that would end the war on favorable terms. Casualties mounted among immortal beings who had never before faced the possibility of permanent destruction. while the fabric of reality itself began showing strain from forces that exceeded its normal capacity to contain and channel. Realizing that traditional tactics would never bring swift victory, the god of thunder began to consider riskier strategies, ones that carried greater danger but held the promise of ending the war outright. His attention turned to the Titanomachy, the 100-handed giants whose imprisonment in Tartarus had paralleled that of the Cyclopes, but whose liberation would present far greater challenges due to their chaotic nature and unpredictable loyalties. Unlike the Cyclopes, whose gratitude could be assumed and whose skills clearly benefited their liberators, the Titanomachy represented forces of pure destruction, whose alliance might prove as dangerous to friends as to enemies. Their freedom could tip the balance of cosmic warfare, yet unleashing them carried risks that even desperate circumstances might not justify. The Sky Lord found himself at a crossroads where strength alone could not guide him. Only careful judgment could decide if victory was worth the shadows it might bring. Gaius, Cottus, and Briareus, the three Titanomachy, whose names meant giant, striker, and strong, had spent their imprisonment developing hatred that transcended normal emotional boundaries and approached cosmic forces in its intensity. Their liberation required not just physical rescue, but psychological preparation that would channel their destructive capabilities toward appropriate targets, while preventing them from attacking anyone within reach once their bonds were removed. Successful recruitment of these ultimate weapons required diplomacy that balanced promises of revenge against guarantees of future restraint, offers of freedom against acceptance of necessary discipline. The ruler of Olympus's negotiations with the Titanomachy demonstrated political skills that complemented his growing military reputation, proving that he possessed the complex abilities that effective cosmic governance would require, rather than mere talent for destructive violence. When the 100-handed giants finally joined his forces, their impact on the war's trajectory exceeded even optimistic projections. Each possessed strength that could hurl mountains like pebbles, while maintaining accuracy that made them devastatingly effective artillery units. Their appearance on Olympian battlefields created panic among Titanic forces, who had never faced enemies capable of throwing hundreds of boulders simultaneously with precision that made evasion impossible. Final phase of the Titanomachy saw traditional battle lines collapse as the Titanomachy's intervention created chaos that neither side could control through conventional tactics. In a final bid to shift the war's course, the Father of Time urged his allies into reckless offensives meant to eliminate the young Stormbringer, who in turn advanced with strategies meant to seal his ultimate triumph. Mount Othrys itself became the focal point for climactic engagements that would determine not just victory or defeat, but the fundamental character of whatever order emerged from the conflict's resolution. The god of thunder spearheaded assaults on strongholds that had weathered countless eras of celestial strife, while the Titan King clung to positions that symbolized not just power, but the very foundation of order he feared losing to history. The god of gods delivered the final blow. His thunderbolts ripped into the core of the citadel, and though the Titans scrambled to patch the wounds, the Olympians were already inside. Hand-to-hand combat raged through corridors that had once echoed with peaceful deliberations, while the collision of opposing forces generated earthquakes that split continents and altered the geography of entire regions. Cronus fell not through single combat with his son, but through the accumulated weight of strategic disadvantages that his enemy's superior preparation and equipment had created. Surrounded by foes whose weapons outmatched his own and whose numbers had grown through successful alliance building, the former cosmic ruler faced the same fate he had once inflicted upon his own father: defeat, humiliation, and exile from the throne he had occupied through centuries of increasing tyranny. Victory's aftermath required decisions about punishment that would influence cosmic governance throughout the ages to come. The young god chose to demonstrate both justice and mercy by consigning most of the defeated Titans to imprisonment in Tartarus, rather than inflicting the complete destruction that their rebellion might have warranted. This policy established precedents for treating conquered enemies that reflected the young god's understanding that excessive harshness could create future problems, while appropriate restraint might eventually transform enemies into allies. The World-Bearer was given a punishment unlike any other, one that acknowledged both his central role in the Titan resistance and the god of gods' need to make an example for any who might challenge the new order. Condemned to bear the weight of the heavens upon his shoulders for all eternity, the giant became a permanent reminder that challenging legitimate authority would bring suffering proportionate to the rebellion's magnitude and duration. With victory achieved and enemies either imprisoned or reconciled, Zeus faced the enormous task of organizing cosmic governance according to principles that would provide both effective administration and lasting stability. His first priority involved dividing the universe's major domains among his brothers in ways that recognized their contributions to victory, while preventing future conflicts over territorial boundaries and administrative responsibilities. Drawing lots to determine their respective spheres of influence, the three brothers who had led the rebellion against Titanic rule established the framework that would govern immortal politics throughout subsequent ages. The god of thunder laid claim to the heavens, establishing himself as master of the skies, wielding control over storms and wind not just for power, but to affirm his place as ruler of the cosmos. Poseidon received dominion over the seas, gaining control of waters that covered most of the world's surface, while commanding forces whose power rivaled those of his brother's storms. His realm included not just oceans and rivers, but all creatures that dwelt within aquatic environments, making him master of resources that mortal civilizations would depend upon for both sustenance and transportation throughout their historical development. Hades accepted rulership over the underworld, assuming responsibility for governing the dead, while managing the enormous wealth that lay buried beneath the Earth's surface. Though his domain might have seemed less attractive than those claimed by his brothers, its importance would become apparent as mortal populations grew, and the questions of death, judgment, and afterlife achieved central significance in human religious thinking. Earth itself remained common territory that all three brothers would share rather than dividing among themselves, recognizing that mortal affairs would require cooperation between heavenly, oceanic, and chthonic powers, working in coordination rather than competition. This arrangement established patterns of divine intervention in human history that would continue throughout the classical period and beyond. Establishing the new order required more than mere territorial division. It demanded the creation of institutions capable of maintaining justice while preventing the corruption that had destroyed previous regimes. The Stormbringer summoned the Titans who had not stood against him, granting them roles in his reign that acknowledged their age-old knowledge while binding them to the principles of a reshaped cosmos. Themis, personification of divine law and proper custom, became one of his most trusted advisors, helping to establish legal frameworks that would govern both immortal and mortal affairs according to principles of justice rather than mere expedience. Her influence ensured that the new order would operate according to consistent rules, rather than the arbitrary decisions that had characterized previous reigns. Mnemosyne, embodiment of memory and recollection, received responsibility for preserving the lessons learned during the Titanomachy, while ensuring that future generations would understand both the necessity of rebellion against tyranny and the importance of maintaining legitimate authority once it had been properly established. Her place in the new divine order revealed the God of God's belief that lasting stability depended on a deep memory, one able to tell noble defiance from simple hunger for power. Oceanus, despite his relationship to the defeated ruler, retained his position as master of the world-encircling river due to his essential role in maintaining the geographical stability that mortal civilizations would require. His example demonstrated that Master of Storm's administration would evaluate individuals based on their capabilities and contributions rather than their family connections or past political affiliations. Final establishment of Olympian order marked the beginning of a new cosmic age, in which divine governance would operate according to principles of justice, merit, and cooperation, rather than the fear, paranoia, and tyranny that had characterized previous regimes. Yet the Storm King understood that maintaining this improved system would require constant vigilance against the corruption that had destroyed his predecessors, along with wisdom that could balance competing interests without creating the resentments that fuel future rebellions. Standing atop Mount Olympus as undisputed master of the universe, Breaker of Titans surveyed a cosmos that had been transformed through violence into something approaching his vision of justice and order. His thunderbolt remained ready to defend legitimate authority against any challenge, while his eyes searched the horizon for threats that might require intervention before they could grow into existential dangers. The sky was not given. It was taken in war, in fire, and in thunder. And from the ashes, the God of gods stood alone, yet no longer truly alone, for he ruled not through fear, but through the willing cooperation of allies who shared his commitment to governance that served creation rather than exploiting it. With victory won, Zeus had to build something far harder than empire, a world governed by justice and fear. Standing atop the mountain that bore his name, the newly crowned king of the gods surveyed a universe scarred by warfare and fractured by the collapse of ancient certainties. Titans lay chained in Tartarus, their rebellion crushed, but their defeat creating a void that demanded filling with institutions capable of maintaining order across cosmic realms that stretched beyond mortal comprehension. Victory alone could not sustain governance. Where Cronus, Lord of the First Age, had ruled through paranoid isolation, and Uranus through ignorant tyranny, Zeus understood that lasting control required systematic organization that balanced competing interests while preventing the corruption that had destroyed previous regimes. His reign would need foundations stronger than mere military supremacy, principles more enduring than personal charisma, and structures more reliable than individual wisdom. Among his first priorities was establishing a celestial court that could provide both effective administration and visible symbols of legitimate rule. Mount Olympus itself required transformation from military headquarters into a seat of government worthy of cosmic rulers, its peaks crowned with palaces that would demonstrate immortal magnificence while serving practical functions that efficient governance demanded. 12 thrones were carved from materials that existed nowhere else in creation: gold that never tarnished, silver that sang when touched by godly hands, and gems that reflected not earthly light, but the radiance of heavenly wisdom itself. Each seat represented both honor and responsibility, marking its occupant as a member of the inner circle that would help shape destiny for gods and mortals alike throughout the ages to come. Selection of the 12 required diplomatic skills that balanced personal loyalty with political necessity, family relationships with administrative competence, and traditional claims with revolutionary innovation. The brothers and sisters of the Storm King held key posts in the new regime, their positions justified by both heritage and service, though their circle had to be expanded to include divine powers suited to more specialized realms. Hera assumed her place as queen not merely through marriage, but through her embodiment of the principles that legitimate unions represented: stability, continuity, and the sacred bonds that hold societies together despite individual ambitions and conflicting interests. Her influence extended beyond domestic affairs to encompass the fundamental relationships that enabled civilization itself, making her support essential for any ruler who hoped to govern through consent rather than coercion alone. Positioning himself at the court's center, the High Thunderer claimed the highest throne while ensuring that his supremacy appeared natural rather than imposed, earned rather than seized, and beneficial rather than exploitative. His seat commanded views of all earthly realms, while remaining accessible to petitioners whose requests for celestial intervention demonstrated both his subjects' dependence and their trust in his willingness to provide just solutions to complex problems. Athena's emergence into the world signaled both victory and sorrow, a sign of the Sky Lord's deepening wisdom, but also a grim reminder of the toll that prophecy demanded from those who held it. Her origins traced back to Metis, the Titaness whose guidance had shaped the war's outcome, yet whose survival risked unleashing a son fated to surpass the god of thunder himself. Consulting oracles whose accuracy had been proven through centuries of correct predictions, the king of the gods learned that his union with Metis would produce two children. First, a daughter of extraordinary wisdom, then a son whose abilities would surpass even those of his father. This knowledge created an impossible dilemma that tested every principle he claimed to represent, while forcing him to choose between personal security and the moral standards he had established for his reign. In choosing to absorb Metis, the ruler of Olympus made his first great ethical sacrifice, allowing dread to outweigh justice, and in doing so, echoing the tyranny he had once defied. Yet unlike Cronus's consumption of his children, this act served broader purposes than mere self-preservation. It preserved cosmic stability while ensuring that Metis's wisdom would remain available through incorporation into his own consciousness rather than being lost entirely. Months passed as Zeus struggled with headaches that threatened to split his skull, while immortal physicians searched for remedies that could address suffering, whose origins lay beyond normal medical understanding. Hephaestus, whose skills in metalworking had been inherited from his foster parents among volcanic spirits, finally provided relief through the most dramatic surgical procedure in cosmic history, raising his bronze axe with precision that only master craftsmen could achieve. Hephaestus struck Zeus's head at exactly the point where pressure had reached unbearable intensity. The skull split cleanly, releasing not blood but radiance that illuminated the entire heavenly court, while proclaiming the arrival of strength unlike anything previously witnessed in sacred circles. Athena emerged fully grown and completely armed, her grey eyes blazing with intelligence that encompassed both her mother's strategic brilliance and her father's understanding of justice. Her birth cry echoed across dimensions with sounds that seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom of ages, while her first steps left footprints that would guide heroes and lawgivers throughout subsequent history. Unlike other deities, whose domains had been assigned through negotiation or inherited through family relationships, Athena claimed dominion over wisdom, warfare, and craftsmanship through demonstration rather than declaration. Her immediate mastery of complex problems that had puzzled older gods established her right to equal status within the Olympian hierarchy, despite her recent arrival in existence. Acknowledging Athena's singular status required reshaping divine custom. She was at once the daughter of the Sky Lord, the legacy of Metis, and a force whose gifts defied conventional roles. Her throne, positioned at her father's right hand, symbolized both paternal pride and political alliance, while ensuring that her counsel would remain available for decisions that required both wisdom and justice. Sacred hierarchy expanded as other beings requested inclusion in the Olympian system, or received invitations based on their essential contributions to cosmic governance. Apollo arrived from northern regions, where his cult had flourished among peoples whose appreciation for art, music, and prophecy prepared them to understand his multifaceted nature and complex requirements for proper worship. Bringing Apollo into the fold required negotiation that respected his role as seer and oracle, even as the thunder wielder ensured that the final word on fate remained his alone. The solution involved establishing Delphi as Apollo's primary shrine, while ensuring that major oracular pronouncements would reflect Olympian policy rather than independent sacred will that might contradict established governmental decisions. Artemis followed her twin brother into the celestial court, bringing with her mastery over hunting, wilderness, and the protection of young creatures whose innocence deserved immortal safeguarding. Her fierce independence and rejection of traditional marriage arrangements challenged conventional expectations about female deities, while providing valuable perspectives on governance that purely masculine approaches might overlook or misunderstand. Demeter's inclusion recognized not just her sisterly relationship to the king of gods, but her essential role in maintaining the agricultural cycles that mortal civilizations required for survival and prosperity. Her command over grain, seasons, and fertility made her cooperation crucial for any administration that hoped to govern through prosperity, rather than imposing order through fear and punishment alone. Hephaestus gained recognition through his unmatched skills in metalworking and engineering, capabilities that provided both practical benefits and symbolic significance for a regime that needed to demonstrate its superiority over previous arrangements. His workshops beneath volcanic mountains produced marvels that enhanced Olympian prestige, while supplying weapons and tools that maintained military readiness against potential threats. Ares entered the pantheon as embodiment of warfare's necessary but dangerous aspects, representing the violent capabilities that peaceful governance required for protection against enemies who respected only force. By allowing his participation, the Stormbringer signaled a recognition that true order sometimes called for choices that clashed with rigid interpretations of moral purity. Aphrodite's integration proved most complex due to her origins in the violence that had overthrown Uranus and her association with forces that could destabilize even the most carefully constructed political arrangements. Yet her influence over love, beauty, and the attractions that bind individuals together made her cooperation essential for social stability that extended beyond mere governmental efficiency. Establishing celestial law required creating frameworks that could govern immortal behavior, while providing guidance for mortal affairs that would inevitably become entangled with heavenly politics. The ruler of Olympus wove together childhood lessons in justice with wisdom, earned by witnessing the cracks that had shattered former divine orders. Themis became his primary legal advisor, her personification of proper custom and sacred law, providing institutional continuity that connected new arrangements with ancient traditions that retained validity despite political upheavals. Her influence ensured that Olympian jurisprudence would operate according to consistent principles, rather than arbitrary decisions that reflected temporary circumstances or personal preferences. Empowering the fates reflected the High Thunderer's foresight, a way to ensure the cosmos remained justly governed, even in moments when his silence or absence was necessary. Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, Spinner, Allotter, and Inevitable, received control over destiny itself, while remaining subject to limitations that prevented them from contradicting his fundamental policies or undermining his ultimate supremacy. Hooray emerged as personifications of seasonal order and proper timing, their influence extending beyond agricultural concerns to encompass the broader principle that effective action required understanding when circumstances favored particular approaches and when patience served better than immediate intervention. Their integration into Olympian administration provided systematic methods for coordinating celestial activities with natural cycles that mortals observed and depended upon. Marriage alliances emerged as vital instruments for forging bonds that offered both emotional fulfillment and strategic gain, reflecting the God of God's intent to uphold legitimate family ties, even as his actions sometimes strayed from those ideals. His union with Hera, though troubled by conflicts over his numerous affairs, established precedents for sacred matrimony that influenced mortal understanding of marriage throughout subsequent history. Successive marriages to Themis, Mnemosyne, and other deities served specific political purposes, while producing offspring whose abilities would prove essential for maintaining cosmic governance throughout future ages. These unions demonstrated his sophisticated understanding that royal marriages should serve state interests rather than mere personal desires, though his frequent inability to maintain such discipline would create ongoing difficulties for his administration. Organizing mortal worship required establishing institutions that could channel human devotion toward purposes that supported rather than challenged heavenly rule, while providing believers with genuine spiritual benefits that justified their continued loyalty. Temple construction, sacrificial protocols, and priestly hierarchies all needed coordination that balanced local customs with universal principles. Sacred centers emerged throughout the Mediterranean world as focal points for worship that demonstrated Olympian might, while serving practical functions in local communities. These institutions provided both religious services and administrative capabilities that extended immortal influence into regions where direct intervention might prove impossible or counterproductive. Establishing the ages of man provided temporal framework for cosmic history that explained both past achievements and future possibilities, while positioning Zeus's reign as the culmination of progressive development that would continue indefinitely under proper guidance. This chronological system served both philosophical and political purposes by demonstrating that change could be beneficial when properly managed rather than inherently destructive. Golden Age memories preserved appreciation for the prosperity that Cronus's rule had provided, while acknowledging that such conditions could not continue without the innovations that Zeus's administration introduced. This interpretation of history balanced respect for ancestral achievements with justification for revolutionary changes that had disrupted established patterns in service of higher principles. Silver and Bronze Ages represented intermediate periods when heavenly guidance remained available, but required increasingly complex methods for effective implementation as mortal societies grew more sophisticated and their needs more demanding. These historical phases demonstrated that progress was possible but not automatic, requiring ongoing cooperation between celestial and terrestrial leadership. Current Iron Age challenges reflected both the difficulties inherent in governing diverse populations and the opportunities that such complexity created for leaders capable of managing competing interests while maintaining overall coherence. For the ruler of Olympus, these tests would prove whether his new systems held the strength to last, or if, like the old world, they were destined to unravel. Justice became the central principle that unified all aspects of Olympian governance, providing both practical guidance for specific decisions and moral legitimacy that justified godly intervention in mortal affairs. For the Sky Lord, justice meant more than vengeance. it also demanded a fair distribution of recognition and reward for those who upheld the values of the new order. Dyke, personification of human justice, received particular honor as the representative of sacred law operating within mortal communities. Her dominion provided connection between Olympian principles and earthly implementation, while ensuring that local variations in legal practice remained consistent with universal standards that transcended cultural differences. Implementation of justice required creating mechanisms that could function effectively despite the enormous disparities in strength, knowledge, and moral development that characterized the various populations under celestial governance. These systems needed flexibility that could accommodate different circumstances while maintaining consistency that prevented arbitrary decisions from undermining public confidence in immortal fairness. Oath-keeping emerged as fundamental requirement for participation in any system that depended on voluntary cooperation rather than coercive enforcement alone. Zeus's role as guardian of oaths provided both practical benefits for those who honored their commitments and terrible punishments for those who violated promises that had invoked sacred witness to their sincerity. Heavenly wrath became both deterrent against misconduct and demonstration of cosmic justice that operated according to principles rather than favoritism or caprice. Lightning, in the hands of the Sky Father, represented command over heaven and earth, but the power's true meaning came through his restraint, a signal that justice must serve renewal, not revenge. To finalize his cosmic order, the God of Gods founded institutions designed to endure through structure and process, rather than relying solely on his constant oversight. These arrangements represented his understanding that effective governance required delegation of responsibility to capable subordinates, whose specialized knowledge could address problems that required more detailed attention than any single ruler could provide. Administrative efficiency became hallmark of Olympian government, distinguishing it from the chaotic improvisation that had characterized previous regimes, while demonstrating that celestial rule could enhance rather than replace mortal capabilities when properly coordinated. This approach established patterns of sacred human cooperation that would influence Mediterranean civilization throughout its classical development. Standing before his completed court, the King of Gods surveyed arrangements that transformed military victory into governmental achievement, while establishing foundations for cosmic order that could endure despite future challenges and changes. His throne commanded not just through might, but through justice, not just through fear, but through genuine benefit to those who accepted his leadership and cooperated with his policies. From his heavenly palace, he could observe all earthly realms while remaining connected to the cosmic forces that his position required him to channel and direct. His reign had begun not with conquest alone, but with construction, the careful building of systems that could maintain peace through strength, prosperity through cooperation, and justice through wisdom that balanced competing claims according to principles rather than mere expedience. The war had ended, but rule had only begun, and he would rule not through fire, but by the weight of cosmic order that transformed chaos into civilization, while ensuring that civilization itself would never become the source of the very tyranny it had been created to prevent. Even gods test their king, and the earth remembers those who dared rise against thunder. Establishing cosmic order had proven easier than maintaining it, for success itself bred the very ambitions that threatened to destroy what victory had created. Within the marble halls of Olympus, where golden light reflected off surfaces that had witnessed the birth of justice, shadows gathered as mighty beings who had accepted subordination began questioning whether their submission had been wisdom or weakness. Among the 12, resentment festered like poison in wounds that had never properly healed. Hera's rage over her husband's countless infidelities had transformed from personal grievance into political opposition, her wounded pride seeking expression through acts that would humble the king, who treated marriage vows as mere suggestions rather than sacred obligations. Her beauty masked calculations that would have impressed the most sophisticated mortal conspirators, while her position as queen provided access to secrets that could topple the very throne she appeared to support. Poseidon's dissatisfaction ran deeper than marital discord, rooted in his conviction that the lottery-dividing cosmic domains had cheated him of his rightful inheritance. Lord of the seas though he was, his realm remained subject to atmospheric forces that his brother controlled, making his authority dependent upon the Sky King's restraint rather than his own absolute sovereignty. Storm-tossed waters obeyed the celestial ruler's will, while earthquakes that should have demonstrated oceanic might instead served to remind all observers that even the earth itself trembled before heavenly commands. Athena's motivations proved most complex, driven not by personal ambition, but by philosophical disagreement with policies that prioritize stability over innovation, order over wisdom, control over growth. Her grey eyes, which had blazed with approval during her father's rise to supremacy, now reflected disappointment with leadership that seemed to value submission more than excellence, compliance more than creativity, fear more than justice. Meeting in chambers where sound could not penetrate, and where even immortal senses could not detect their presence, the three conspirators planned an uprising that would either reform the administration or replace it entirely with governance more responsive to legitimate concerns. Their strategy required perfect coordination and absolute secrecy, for discovery would mean punishments that made titanic imprisonment seem merciful by comparison. Choosing their moment with care that reflected both their desperation and their intelligence, the rebels struck when the king had dismissed his guards and retired to chambers where he believed himself safe from any conceivable threat. Golden chains materialized from nothingness, wrapping around his limbs with binding force that even celestial strength could not break, while enchantments woven by Athena's wisdom prevented him from calling upon the lightning that had become his signature weapon. Victory seemed assured as the conspirators gazed upon their captive, whose struggles only tightened bonds that drew their might from sources older than Olympian authority itself. Yet their triumph contained the seeds of its own destruction, for they had acted from noble motives that prevented them from taking the final step that successful revolutions demanded. They could not bring themselves to destroy the very ruler whose reforms they sought to compel. Hours passed as the Thunderlord hung suspended in chains that grew heavier with each moment of his captivity, his immortal essence slowly draining away. As the bonds drew sustenance from his celestial vitality, his captors debated terms that would secure his release while guaranteeing the changes they demanded, unaware that their deliberations were being observed by eyes that saw through deceptions no mortal could penetrate. Thetis, the sea nymph, whose beauty had attracted attention from gods and whose wisdom had earned respect from mortals, witnessed the conspiracy through methods that bypassed every precaution the rebels had established. Her decision to intervene reflected not political calculation, but personal gratitude toward the sovereign who had treated her with honor, despite his position to demand whatever he desired from beings far less mighty than himself. Racing through oceanic depths with speed that transformed water into mere mist around her passage, Thetis sought aid from allies, whose loyalty transcended immediate self-interest. Her destination lay in the deepest parts of Tartarus, where beings imprisoned since the Cosmic War's conclusion retained both the capability to influence events and reasons to support the regime that had provided them with better treatment than previous rulers had offered. Briareus answered her summons with enthusiasm that reflected both gratitude for improved conditions and genuine admiration for leadership that had proven superior to anything in his extensive experience. This 100-handed giant, whose very name struck terror into hearts that had witnessed his performance during the Titanomachy, ascended from his subterranean domain with eagerness that demonstrated how completely governmental policies had transformed potential enemies into devoted supporters. Arriving at Olympus with stealth that belied his enormous size, Briareus easily overcame enchantments that had been designed to prevent celestial intervention rather than resistance from beings whose nature transcended normal categories. His approach went undetected until the moment when his multiple hands began working simultaneously to untangle bonds that required techniques beyond the conspirator's ability to counter or even comprehend. Liberation came swiftly once Briareus applied his specialized knowledge to constraints that had seemed unbreakable moments before. The Sky King emerged from captivity with fury that illuminated the entire mountain, while thunder announced to every corner of creation that royal authority had been restored through methods that demonstrated both his resourcefulness and the loyalty he inspired among those who truly understood his character. Punishment for the failed conspiracy reflected sophisticated understanding of justice that balanced consequences with causes, demonstrating that even rebellion, motivated by legitimate concerns, would face appropriate responses, while acknowledging that some grievances deserved attention rather than mere suppression. His treatment of the conspirators established precedents that would govern immortal politics throughout subsequent ages. Hera received exile rather than imprisonment, her banishment to distant regions serving both as penalty for treachery and opportunity for reflection that might restore their marriage to foundations more solid than mere political convenience. Her temporary absence from Olympus also provided the Thunderlord with freedom to address the deeper issues that had motivated her opposition, demonstrating wisdom that transcended simple vindictiveness. Poseidon faced restrictions on his oceanic dominion that curtailed his ability to generate storms capable of threatening human navigation, while his participation in future policy discussions would require explicit permission rather than assumed inclusion. These limitations served as constant reminders that subordination meant accepting boundaries rather than constantly testing their enforcement. Athena's situation proved most delicate, for her opposition had stemmed from principles rather than personal grievances, making her both more dangerous and more valuable than her fellow conspirators. The royal solution involved expanded responsibilities that channeled her reformist impulses toward constructive purposes, while ensuring that her wisdom would continue serving administrative needs that required her unique capabilities. Yet even as domestic harmony appeared restored, more fundamental challenges emerged from sources that political solutions could never address. Deep within the earth, Gaia's consciousness stirred with anger that had been building since her titanic children's defeat, her grief transforming into rage that demanded expression through acts of vengeance that would either destroy the Olympian regime or die in the attempt. Ancient beyond measure and mighty beyond mortal comprehension, the Earth Mother possessed resources that made heavenly strength seem fragile by comparison. Her decision to create an ultimate weapon represented not desperate gambit, but calculated deployment of capabilities that had remained dormant throughout previous conflicts, waiting for circumstances that would justify their unleashing. From the deepest places where molten rock met crystalline formations older than memory itself, Gaia drew substances that existed nowhere else in creation. Her labor pains, when they finally came, generated earthquakes that split continents, while volcanic eruptions announced the birth of something that would challenge every assumption about the limits of immortal might. Typhon emerged from his terrible gestation as the most fearsome monster creation had ever produced, his form combining aspects of dragons, giants, and natural disasters into a single entity whose very existence violated every principle of cosmic order. His 100 serpent heads spoke in voices that could drive listeners mad, while his eyes blazed with fires that could melt bronze, and his breath carried plagues that could devastate entire regions. Standing taller than mountains and broader than valleys, Typhon represented concentrated malevolence that had been shaped specifically to counter every advantage the celestial regime possessed. His hide could not be pierced by conventional weapons. His strength exceeded that of any individual opponent, and his intelligence, though focused on destruction, operated with cunning that made him far more dangerous than mere mindless violence. Confronting this ultimate enemy required the Thunder King to employ every resource at his disposal, while accepting risks that victory in conventional warfare had never demanded. His first assault, launched with confidence born from previous triumphs, demonstrated both his courage and the inadequacy of standard tactics against an opponent whose very nature transcended normal categories of immortal conflict. Lightning bolts that had never failed to find their targets struck Typhon's hide, only to dissipate harmlessly, their energy absorbed by scales that had been designed specifically to neutralize the Skylord's primary weapon. Thunder that had once announced cosmic authority now seemed merely loud rather than authoritative, while winds that had served as invisible allies proved ineffective against an enemy whose mass created its own weather patterns. Typhon's counterattack revealed capabilities that surpassed even pessimistic projections about his potential threat to established order. Serpent heads struck with speed that made evasion impossible, while secreting venoms that could incapacitate celestial flesh, their fangs tearing through defenses that had protected the king throughout every previous battle. Most terrifyingly, the monster's success seemed to energize him rather than exhaust his resources, suggesting that victory would only make him stronger. Defeat came suddenly and completely, the royal form falling to earth with impact that created craters still visible to travelers who possessed knowledge of where to look. Typhon's victory celebration involved dismembering his fallen enemy with methodical precision that demonstrated both his intelligence and his understanding that permanent triumph required eliminating rather than merely defeating his opposition. Extracting the Thunder Lord's sinews, the immortal tissues that connected conscious will to physical capability, Typhon created a trophy that would serve as both evidence of his success and insurance against his victim's potential recovery. These essential components of celestial nature were hidden in locations known only to the monster himself, their concealment making rescue impossible for any being who lacked knowledge of their whereabouts. Yet even in apparent defeat, previous wisdom in building alliances based on genuine loyalty rather than mere fear proved decisive for ultimate survival. Hermes and Pan, whose dedication transcended immediate self-interest, undertook the desperate mission that would either restore their fallen sovereign or join him in destruction that seemed increasingly inevitable with each passing moment. Using stealth that exploited their specialized knowledge of hidden paths and concealed approaches, the two rescuers penetrated Typhon's defenses through methods that relied more on cleverness than force. Their success in recovering the royal sinews and restoring his immortal essence demonstrated that victory often belonged to those who persevered, rather than those who possessed obvious advantages. Renewed battle between restored king and undefeated monster raged across landscapes that would bear permanent scars from their conflict. Mountains relocated by casual blows, while seas boiled from the heat generated by their collision. This final confrontation transcended mere personal combat to become symbolic struggle between order and chaos, justice and malevolence, civilization and the primitive forces that threatened its destruction. Ultimate victory required not just superior strength, but strategic thinking that turned Typhon's own might against him. Rather than meeting force with force, the Sky King employed tactics that exploited his enemy's overconfidence while utilizing terrain features that could amplify rather than diminish his own capabilities. Mount Etna became both battlefield and prison as the Thunderlord drove his defeated enemy deep into volcanic depths, where molten rock would serve as chains that no strength could break. Typhon's continued existence beneath Sicily would ensure that his rage found expression through eruptions that reminded future generations about the price of challenging legitimate authority, while his imprisonment demonstrated that even the mightiest rebels could be contained by leaders whose wisdom matched their force. Victory over Typhon established reputation for invincibility that would discourage future challenges, while proving that the regime possessed resources sufficient to overcome any conceivable threat. Yet this triumph also revealed vulnerabilities that more subtle opponents might exploit, creating necessities for constant vigilance that would characterize leadership throughout subsequent ages. Gigantomachy erupted as Gaia's second attempt at revenge, her creation of the giants representing a different approach that emphasized numbers and coordination rather than individual supremacy. These earthborn warriors, each formidable enough to challenge lesser gods while operating in concert, that multiplied their individual capabilities, posed threats that required responses different from those that had proven effective against singular enemies. Unlike Typhon's chaotic assault, the Giants' campaign followed strategic principles that demonstrated learning from previous failures, while exploiting weaknesses that careful observation had revealed in Olympian defenses. Their attacks targeted specific installations and individuals whose elimination would cripple the ability to coordinate resistance, while their movements followed patterns that made prediction and countermeasures extremely difficult. Prophecies surrounding this conflict revealed that celestial victory would require mortal assistance, creating necessities for alliances that transcended traditional boundaries between immortal and human realms. Heracles, whose parentage connected him to both categories, while his achievements demonstrated capabilities that exceeded normal limitations, became the crucial factor whose participation would determine whether order or chaos would ultimately prevail. Coordinated defense against the giants required military innovations that combined Olympian advantages with mortal resourcefulness, creating tactical approaches that neither side could have developed independently. Victory, when it finally came, established precedents for divine human cooperation that would influence Mediterranean civilization throughout its classical development. Prometheus presented challenges entirely different from those posed by monsters or warriors, his rebellion rooted in philosophical disagreements that could not be resolved through combat alone. His theft of fire represented more than simple crime. It embodied principles about knowledge, progress, and the relationship between celestial prerogatives and mortal needs that struck at fundamental assumptions about cosmic governance. Defying royal policies regarding human development, Prometheus provided mortals with capabilities that transformed their relationship to both natural environment and heavenly authority. Fire meant more than mere warmth or light. It represented technology, civilization, and the potential for independence that might eventually challenge the very foundations upon which Olympian supremacy rested. His punishment required methods that would serve both justice and deterrence, while acknowledging that his motivations, however misguided, reflected genuine concern for beings whose welfare deserved consideration. The solution involved consequences that were both terrible and symbolic, demonstrating that even well-intentioned rebellion would face responses proportionate to the challenges it presented to established order. chained to peaks where his suffering would remain visible to any who sought evidence of celestial justice. Prometheus endured daily torment that would continue until he chose cooperation over defiance. His eagle tormentor, tearing at flesh that regenerated only to be torn again, provided constant reminder that some boundaries could not be crossed without accepting costs that made victory indistinguishable from defeat. Standing victorious over domestic conspiracies, monstrous assaults, and philosophical challenges, the Thunder King had proven that his authority rested on foundations more solid than mere force or temporary advantage. His reign had survived tests that would have destroyed lesser leadership, while establishing principles and precedents that would guide cosmic governance throughout the ages to come. Each trial had revealed different aspects of the complex responsibilities that legitimate rulership demanded, demonstrating that maintaining order required not just strength, but wisdom, not just victory, but justice, not just might, but the restraint that prevented authority from becoming the very tyranny it had been created to replace. Thunder may rule the sky, but it must silence rebellion one roar at a time, proving through each challenge overcome that the voice of justice speaks louder than the whispers of chaos, that the light of order shines brighter than the darkness of primordial forces, and that civilization's achievements deserve protection against any threat that would return creation to the void from which it had emerged. His thunder shaped the heavens. His desire shaped the world of men. From his celestial throne, Zeus gazed upon the earthly realm, where humans struggled through brief lives filled with joys and sorrows that stirred something profound within his immortal consciousness. Unlike his fellow Olympians, who viewed terrestrial affairs with detached amusement or clinical interest, the king of the gods felt drawn to participate directly in the dramas unfolding beneath the clouds he commanded. Among all creation's children, humans possessed qualities that fascinated their celestial observers: mortality that made each moment precious, creativity that transformed raw materials into art and civilization, and passions that burned with intensity unknown to beings whose existence stretched across cosmic ages. These fragile creatures, neither fully beast nor approaching godhood, represented possibilities that sparked the Thunderlord's curiosity and awakened desires that would reshape both earthly and heavenly realms. Transformation became his method for bridging the vast gulf separating immortal nature from human experience. Rather than appearing in his true form, which would have incinerated any earthly being who gazed upon such radiance, the Sky King learned to assume shapes that could approach terrestrial creatures without destroying them through proximity to strength beyond their capacity to endure. Europa discovered this truth while gathering flowers along the Phoenician coast, her companions laughing as they wove garlands from blossoms that seemed more beautiful than usual on this particular morning. Among the cattle grazing nearby, one bull stood apart from the rest, larger, more magnificent, with hide the color of fresh snow and eyes that held intelligence no ordinary beast possessed. Approaching with the fearlessness of youth, combined with noble birth that had never known genuine danger, Europa marveled at the creature's gentleness as it allowed her to stroke its flanks and eventually climb upon its back. Her delight turned to amazement as the bull began moving toward the sea, then to terror mixed with wonder as it plunged into waves that parted before its passage like liquid crystal. Across the Mediterranean they traveled, the disguised god revealing his identity only gradually as his passengers' fear gave way to recognition that she rode no ordinary animal, but something far more wondrous. Their journey ended on Crete's shores, where the Thunder King resumed his true form, long enough to father children whose descendants would rule the island and establish legal traditions that would influence civilization throughout subsequent centuries. Minos Europa's eldest son, would become legendary for wisdom that seemed to derive from sources beyond human understanding, his laws reflecting principles of justice that earthly minds alone could never have conceived. His brothers, Rhadamanthes and Sarpedon, would similarly achieve greatness that demonstrated their celestial heritage, while serving temporal kingdoms that benefited from their supernatural insights. Leda experienced a different form of divine courtship when Zeus appeared as a swan of extraordinary beauty, its feathers gleaming with radiance that seemed to capture and reflect the light of distant stars. Her encounter with this magnificent creature occurred beside the river Eurotas, where she had gone to bathe in waters that sparkled with unusual clarity on that fateful evening. From their union came offspring, whose destinies would shake the foundations of the human world. Helen, whose beauty would launch 1,000 ships and bring about the destruction of Troy, and Pollux, whose boxing skills would make him legendary among heroes, while his devotion to his twin Castor would earn them both places among the constellations. Danae's story began with prophecy and imprisonment, her father Acrisius having learned from oracles that his daughter's son would one day cause his death. Determined to prevent this fate, the king locked his child in a bronze chamber where no man could reach her, believing that isolation would guarantee his safety while preserving his bloodline through eventual marriage to a suitable partner. The Sky Lord's solution to this challenge demonstrated both his ingenuity and his determination to father the hero whose birth had been foretold. Transforming himself into golden rain, he descended through gaps too small for physical form to penetrate, filling Danae's prison with radiance that seemed to carry all the warmth and joy that her captivity had denied her. Perseus emerged from this union, destined for achievements that would surpass those of any previous hero, his celestial heritage providing strength and courage that would enable him to face monsters no purely human warrior could hope to defeat. His slaying of Medusa, rescue of Andromeda, and eventual founding of cities would establish patterns of heroic behavior that future generations would struggle to emulate. Alcmene's seduction required the Thunderlord to assume the form of her husband Amphitryon, creating deceptions that extended the natural length of their wedding night to ensure that their union would produce the greatest of all heroes. This elaborate subterfuge reflected both the god's growing sophistication in earthly matters and his understanding that some destinies required careful orchestration rather than spontaneous passion. Heracles, born from this carefully planned encounter, would embody the perfect fusion of immortal strength with human determination, his 12 labors demonstrating that temporal will could accomplish tasks that seemed to require supernatural intervention. His struggles against both monsters and madness would provide inspiration for countless future heroes, while establishing him as the bridge between human and celestial realms. Throughout these earthly adventures, Zeus maintained his role as cosmic ruler, while discovering that involvement in terrestrial affairs provided satisfactions that governing immortals could never match. Humans' brief lives made their achievements more precious, their struggles more meaningful, and their triumphs more worthy of celebration than anything his fellow gods accomplished through their effortless manipulation of natural forces. Yet these pleasures came with costs that would test both his marriage and his wisdom. Hera's jealousy, initially focused on his celestial infidelities, transformed into something far more dangerous when she realized that his earthly lovers threatened her position in ways that immortal rivals never could. These human women bore children who carried the Thunder King's essence into the terrestrial realm, creating bloodlines that might eventually challenge Olympian supremacy itself. Her persecution campaigns against Zeus's human consorts and their offspring revealed the depths of rage that wounded pride could generate in hearts accustomed to absolute authority. Io suffered transformation into a heifer, pursued across continents by a gadfly that allowed her no rest until exhaustion nearly claimed her life. Semele faced destruction when Hera's trickery convinced her to demand that the Sky Lord appear in his true form, an encounter that no earthly flesh could survive. Heracles endured the most systematic harassment, his celestial stepmother's hatred manifesting through trials that began with serpents in his cradle and continued through madness that caused him to murder his own family. Yet these persecutions ultimately served to prove, rather than diminish, his heroic nature. Each challenge overcome, adding to his legend, while demonstrating that divine heritage required testing through adversity. Responding to Hera's excesses required the Thunderlord to balance justice with family harmony, protecting his human offspring while avoiding conflicts that might destabilize Olympian governance. His solutions often involved subtle interventions that provided assistance without appearing to challenge his queen's authority directly, maintaining domestic peace while ensuring that innocents did not suffer for their celestial parentage. Beyond personal relationships, Zeus assumed responsibility for maintaining cosmic justice that extended protection to all who honored proper relationships between immortals and humans. Guest friendship, that sacred bond connecting hosts with visitors, fell under his special protection, with violations drawing punishments that demonstrated divine commitment to civilized behavior. Lycaon learned this lesson through transformation that reflected the bestial nature his actions had revealed. When the Arcadian king served human flesh to the Thunder King as a test of divine omniscience, his punishment involved becoming the very savage creature his behavior had shown him to be. The werewolf that Lycaon became served as permanent warning that some boundaries could not be crossed without accepting consequences that matched the crime's enormity. Marriage oaths similarly received celestial protection that made their violation dangerous for both humans and immortals, who might be tempted to treat such promises lightly. The Sky Lord's own infidelities created apparent contradictions in this policy, yet his interventions consistently supported the principle that sacred vows deserved respect even when his personal behavior fell short of the standards he enforced. Monitoring human behavior from his heavenly vantage point, Zeus observed developments that increasingly troubled his sense of justice and cosmic order. The Bronze Age, which had begun with promise and achievement, gradually deteriorated as prosperity led to arrogance. Strength enabled oppression, and technological advancement served destructive rather than constructive purposes. Violence escalated beyond what competitive societies typically experienced, while religious observances declined as humans began believing that their achievements placed them beyond celestial oversight. Most troubling was the emergence of deliberate cruelty that served no purpose except inflicting suffering on victims who possessed no means of resistance or revenge. These observations convinced the Thunderlord that intervention was required to preserve both human potential and cosmic justice. Yet unlike previous divine responses to terrestrial problems, this situation demanded solutions that would eliminate systemic corruption, rather than merely punishing individual transgressors. The scope of necessary action would require methods unprecedented in their thoroughness and finality. Consultation with the Fates revealed that humanity's decline had reached points beyond simple correction, requiring cleansing that would eliminate current populations while preserving genetic and cultural foundations for eventual renewal. This terrible knowledge forced Zeus to contemplate actions that would rival the Titanomachy in their scope, while serving purposes that transcended mere conquest or personal advantage. Planning the Great Flood required coordination with Poseidon, whose oceanic domain would provide the mechanisms for terrestrial cleansing, and careful consideration of which human bloodlines possessed sufficient virtue to deserve preservation. The selection process revealed both the rarity of genuine righteousness and the importance of maintaining hope for humanity's eventual redemption. Deucalion and Pyrrha, chosen for their piety and ethical integrity, received warnings that enabled them to construct vessels capable of surviving the deluge that would reshape the Mediterranean world. Their survival ensured that post-flood civilization would inherit the best aspects of previous achievements, while avoiding the corruption that had made destruction necessary. When the waters finally receded, revealing landscapes scoured clean of cities that had defied celestial will, the Thunder King surveyed a world ready for renewal, according to principles that balanced human freedom with cosmic justice. The new age that began would benefit from lessons learned through catastrophe, while retaining possibilities for achievement that made earthly existence worth preserving. Deucalion's role as humanity's second father paralleled Zeus's position as cosmic patriarch. Their cooperation in repopulating the cleansed world, establishing patterns of divine-human partnership that would characterize future relationships between celestial and terrestrial realms. The stones they cast, which became new human beings, symbolized the necessity for starting fresh, while building upon foundations that had proven their worth through testing. From his throne atop Olympus, the Sky Lord could observe the renewed world where his earthly children and their descendants would continue the eternal drama of human existence. His interventions in terrestrial affairs had taught him that immortal strength required restraint as much as force, wisdom as much as authority, and love as much as justice to govern creation, in ways that served both celestial purposes and human needs. His will had become inseparable from fate itself, yet this ultimate authority carried responsibilities that made omnipotence as much burden as blessing. Every decision rippled through both heavenly and terrestrial realms, while every choice shaped destinies that would influence countless future generations of gods and humans whose lives remained intertwined across the vast tapestry of existence. To be touched by Zeus was to become a legend or a lesson, depending upon how one responded to the honor and terror of attracting attention from the king, whose thunder announced justice, whose lightning illuminated truth, and whose love could elevate humans to heroic greatness, or destroy them through the very intensity of celestial passion that sought expression through union with creation's most fascinating children. Zeus was king, but even a king must bow to what was written before the gods themselves. From his celestial throne, the ruler of Olympus watched as the seeds of the greatest conflict in human history took root in a moment of divine vanity and mortal foolishness. When Eris, goddess of discord, cast her golden apple inscribed "For the fairest" among the wedding guests of Peleus and Thetis, she ignited rivalries that would consume a generation and teach even the mightiest immortals about the limits of their authority. Among the competing goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, none would yield to the others, their pride demanding resolution that no diplomatic solution could provide. The crisis required judgment from a source whose wisdom commanded universal respect. Yet the Thunder King understood immediately that any decision would create enemies whose resentment could destabilize both celestial and terrestrial realms for centuries to come. Declining to judge the beauty contest that would determine history's course, the Sky Lord demonstrated wisdom that transcended immediate political considerations, while revealing the subtle understanding that true leadership sometimes required apparent abdication of responsibility. His refusal to choose among the three goddesses forced them to seek alternative arbitration. Their eventual selection of Paris, Prince of Troy, establishing chains of causation that even divine foresight could not fully predict. Paris's decision to award the apple to Aphrodite in exchange for Helen's love seemed merely another instance of mortal weakness, succumbing to celestial manipulation. Yet its consequences would prove that individual choices, however small, could reshape the cosmic order itself. When the Trojan prince claimed his promised bride from Menelaus's court, he triggered obligations of honor and alliance that would draw every major power in the Mediterranean world into prolonged conflict. Watching the gathering storm clouds that would soon burst over Troy's walls, the King of Heaven found himself caught between competing loyalties that reflected both personal relationships and political necessities. His son Sarpedon ruled among the Lycians who would support Troy, while his daughter Helen's abduction provided justification for Achaean vengeance that demanded divine sanction. Immortal factions formed as other Olympians chose sides based on ancient grudges, personal preferences, and strategic calculations that often contradicted their proclaimed principles. Hera and Athena, still burning with resentment over Paris's judgment, supported the Achaean cause with enthusiasm that sometimes exceeded prudent limits, while Aphrodite naturally favored the Trojans, whose prince had honored her above her rivals. Apollo's allegiance to Troy reflected both his appreciation for their pious devotion and his desire to protect mortals whose artistic achievements honored the civilized values he represented. Artemis followed her brother's example, while Ares, as always, simply sought opportunities for the violence that sustained his essential nature, regardless of which side ultimately prevailed. Poseidon's hatred for Troy stemmed from ancient grievances involving payment, denied for his construction of the city's walls, his oceanic wrath adding personal vengeance to political opposition that made Achaean naval superiority almost inevitable. Only Demeter remained truly neutral, her concern for agricultural cycles transcending the temporary political arrangements that obsessed her fellow immortals. Attempting to maintain cosmic balance while honoring both familial obligations and governmental responsibilities, the Thunderlord initially proclaimed neutrality that would allow the conflict to resolve itself according to purely human capabilities. This policy reflected his growing understanding that celestial intervention often created more problems than it solved, while mortal achievements gained greater meaning when accomplished through their own efforts rather than supernatural assistance. Yet maintaining neutrality proved impossible, as the siege of Troy extended far beyond anyone's initial expectations, the conflict's duration and intensity drawing divine participants deeper into partisan involvement despite their rulers' attempts to preserve impartial oversight. Each Olympian's intervention provoked countermeasures from opposing factions, escalating immortal participation until the war became as much about heavenly politics as terrestrial grievances. Hector's prowess as Troy's greatest defender earned the Sky King's admiration and protection despite his official neutrality, the Trojan prince's courage and nobility representing qualities that commanded respect regardless of political alignment. His temporary dominance over Achaean forces reflected celestial favor that acknowledged personal excellence while avoiding direct contradiction of overall policy. Achilles' withdrawal from combat following his quarrel with Agamemnon created opportunities for Trojan success that seemed to vindicate the Thunder King's preference for balanced conflict rather than one-sided destruction. Yet the Greek hero's eventual return to battle, motivated by grief over Patroclus' death, demonstrated that human emotions could override divine planning when passion reached sufficient intensity. Sarpedon's arrival at Troy as leader of Lycian allies forced the ruler of Olympus to confront the most painful test of his developing wisdom about celestial restraint and cosmic justice. This beloved son, whose valor had earned recognition throughout the Mediterranean world, would face Patroclus in single combat that destiny had already determined would end in the Lycian prince's death. Knowledge of his son's approaching doom tortured the King of Heaven with possibilities that unlimited power seemed to offer, intervention that could save Sarpedon's life, while demonstrating paternal love that transcended abstract principles about fate and justice. The temptation to act grew stronger as the prophesied moment approached, testing every lesson the ruler had learned about the proper exercise of supreme authority. Hera's counsel provided both personal comfort and cosmic perspective when she reminded her husband that saving Sarpedon would establish precedents that other immortals would demand for their own children, ultimately transforming every human conflict into divine warfare that would destroy the very mortal civilizations they sought to protect. Her wisdom helped the Thunderlord understand that true love sometimes required allowing beloved ones to face their destinies without interference. Standing upon Olympus's heights with golden scales in his hands, the Sky King weighed the fates of Sarpedon and Patroclus, while acknowledging that even he must submit to forces greater than individual will or personal desire. The balance that emerged from this cosmic weighing reflected not arbitrary decision, but recognition of patterns woven into reality's fabric before the current generation of gods had assumed their thrones. Sarpedon's death struck the ruler of heaven with grief that shook the foundations of Olympus, while teaching him that absolute power meant accepting absolute responsibility for decisions that caused suffering to those he loved most. His tears, falling as bloody rain upon the battlefield where his son breathed his last, demonstrated that divine nature did not preclude genuine emotion or render immortal hearts immune to mortal anguish. Yet even in his sorrow, the Thunder King ensured that Sarpedon's body received honors appropriate to his heroic nature, dispatching sleep and death to carry the fallen prince home to Lycia, where proper funeral rites would celebrate achievements that had earned immortal remembrance. This final gift reflected both paternal love and royal recognition of excellence that transcended political boundaries. Watching Troy's eventual fall, despite his sympathy for its defenders, the King of Heaven learned that wisdom sometimes demanded witnessing injustice without intervention, accepting outcomes that violated personal preferences while serving larger purposes that individual perspective could not fully comprehend. The city's destruction marked not divine failure, but recognition that some patterns required completion, regardless of their immediate costs. Achilles' own death, following his triumph over Hector, demonstrated that heroic excellence carried prices that even celestial parentage could not eliminate. Thetis's grief over her son's mortality echoed the Thunderlord's sorrow over Sarpedon, while proving that immortal mothers understood pain, no different from what human women experienced when warfare claimed their children. Helen's return to Sparta with Menelaus provided resolution that satisfied honor's demands, while leaving questions about justice that would perplex philosophers for generations. Her role as both prize and prisoner reflected the complex relationships between divine will and human agency that made simple moral judgments impossible for observers who understood the full context of events. Celestial withdrawal from active participation in human affairs marked the war's most significant consequence, establishing precedents for reduced intervention that would characterize the relationship between immortal and mortal realms throughout subsequent ages. The Sky Lord's recognition that excessive divine involvement corrupted rather than enhanced human achievement led to policies that emphasized indirect influence rather than direct control. Future conflicts would unfold according to patterns established during Troy's siege, with heavenly guidance available to those who sought it, while ultimate responsibility resting upon human leaders whose decisions shaped their people's destinies. This arrangement balanced respect for mortal autonomy with acknowledgement that some problems required wisdom beyond purely earthly sources. Contemplating the war's lessons from his celestial palace, the ruler of Olympus understood that true kingship meant accepting limitations, as well as exercising prerogatives, that genuine love sometimes demanded restraint rather than intervention, and that the greatest demonstrations of power often involve choosing not to act rather than displaying overwhelming force. The scales of destiny that had determined Sarpedon's fate continued weighing countless future decisions, their balance reflecting cosmic justice that operated according to principles too complex for any single mind to comprehend fully. Even divine wisdom could only partially understand patterns that stretched across cosmic ages, while influencing individual lives in ways that seemed random but followed hidden logic. Standing before the loom, where the fates wove threads of destiny into tapestries that depicted both mortal and immortal futures, the Thunder King acknowledged that his authority, however vast, operated within constraints that made absolute control both impossible and undesirable. The thunder that announced his presence would continue echoing across creation, yet its voice would speak of justice tempered by mercy rather than power unlimited by wisdom. Even the thunderbolt cannot strike the loom of the fates, and so the King of Heaven watched and wept and let destiny unfold according to patterns that predated his reign, while ensuring that within those cosmic designs, justice would find expression and love would discover meaning, despite the sorrow that seemed inseparable from existence itself. The storms pass, the wars end, and Zeus remains, not a god of love or harvest, but of judgment, fire, and permanence. Standing upon Mount Olympus as master of a cosmos that had tested every aspect of his character and authority, the King of Heaven surveyed realms that bore the permanent imprint of his reign, while acknowledging that true immortality lay not in personal survival, but in the enduring influence of principles established through wisdom earned in struggle. Across the Mediterranean world, from the Black Sea's distant shores to the pillars of Heracles that marked civilization's western boundary, cities raised temples and altars honoring the Panhellenios, the god of all Greeks, whose authority transcended local loyalties and tribal divisions. This universal recognition reflected more than mere political convenience. It demonstrated genuine understanding that cosmic justice required governance that rose above petty interests, while serving ideals worthy of celestial sanction. Sacred centers emerged throughout the Greek world as focal points where divine will intersected with human need, each location chosen for qualities that facilitated communion between terrestrial supplicants and heavenly authority. These sites became laboratories where mortals could experiment with approaches to worship that honored both local traditions and universal principles, creating syntheses that enriched rather than diminished either component. Dodona stood among the oldest and most revered of these holy places, its ancient oak grove whispering secrets that trained priests could interpret, for pilgrims seeking guidance about futures that mortal wisdom alone could not predict. Here, the Thunder King spoke through rustling leaves and sacred doves, whose flight patterns revealed meanings that careful observation could decode, demonstrating that celestial communication operated through natural phenomena rather than spectacular miracles. Within this sanctuary's peaceful groves, questions that had puzzled philosophers and troubled kings found answers that reflected both practical wisdom and cosmic perspective. The oracle's responses, while sometimes cryptic, consistently emphasized themes that had characterized the reign from its earliest days: justice tempered by mercy, strength guided by restraint, and authority exercised for the benefit of those it governed, rather than mere aggrandizement of those who wielded it. Olympia's sacred precinct served different purposes, while honoring the same fundamental principles that had made celestial rule beneficial rather than oppressive. Here, athletic competitions demonstrated human potential, operating at its highest levels while maintaining the peaceful cooperation that made civilization possible, rather than the destructive violence that reduced societies to chaos. Every 4 years, competitors gathered from throughout the Mediterranean world to test their capabilities against peers whose excellence had earned recognition in their home territories. These games provided opportunities for diplomatic contact that prevented minor disputes from escalating into major conflicts, while celebrating achievements that honored both individual determination and heavenly inspiration. Victory wreaths cut from sacred olive trees carried significance that transcended mere athletic accomplishment, representing recognition from cosmic authority that excellence deserved acknowledgement regardless of its manifestation. Champions returned to their cities, bearing not just personal glory, but evidence that their communities possessed virtues worthy of immortal approval. Mount Lycaon's rituals preserved connections to practices that predated Olympian civilization, while adapting ancient customs to serve purposes consistent with evolved understanding about proper relationships between immortal and mortal realms. Here, sacrificial ceremonies maintained traditions whose origins stretched back to humanity's earliest religious experiences, while ensuring that devotional acts served justice rather than mere superstition. Pilgrims who climbed these sacred heights encountered forms of worship that challenged comfortable assumptions about divine nature, while revealing truths that purely intellectual approaches could never discover. The mountain's stark beauty and demanding terrain created conditions where superficial concerns fell away, leaving only essential questions about existence, purpose, and the proper ordering of individual lives within cosmic frameworks. Sacred fires that burned perpetually upon Lycaon's peak served as beacons that could be seen from vast distances, their light reminding observers throughout the surrounding regions that celestial presence remained constant despite the changes that affected all earthly arrangements. These flames represented both invitation and obligation, welcome for those who approached with genuine reverence, warning for those who harbored intentions that violated cosmic order. As guardian of cosmic structure, the Sky Lord assumed responsibilities that extended far beyond governing particular domains or resolving specific disputes. His role encompassed maintaining the fundamental patterns that enabled existence itself to continue functioning, according to principles that served creation rather than destroying it through chaos or entropy. Enforcement of fate required constant vigilance against forces that would disrupt destiny's proper unfolding. Yet this authority demanded wisdom that could distinguish between legitimate intervention and arbitrary interference with processes that needed completion according to their inherent logic. The ruler's experience during the Trojan conflict had taught him that even divine foresight could not always predict which outcomes would ultimately serve justice better than available alternatives. Oaths sworn in his name carried binding force that made their violation dangerous for both mortals and immortals, who might be tempted to treat promises lightly when circumstances made fulfillment inconvenient. This protection of sacred commitments provided foundations for all forms of cooperation that depended upon trust rather than coercion, enabling civilizations to develop beyond primitive levels, where only immediate self-interest motivated behavior. Justice administration required balancing competing claims, according to principles that transcended personal preferences or temporary political arrangements. The Thunder King's decisions established precedents that influenced both celestial and human legal systems throughout subsequent centuries, his judgments reflecting understanding that true fairness demanded consideration of context and consequence, rather than mere application of rigid rules. Relationships with his brothers, Poseidon and Hades, evolved into cooperative partnerships that demonstrated how shared authority could function effectively when based upon mutual respect and clear understanding of appropriate boundaries. Their tripartite division of cosmic responsibility created checks and balances that prevented any single force from dominating creation, while ensuring that essential functions received adequate attention. Regular consultations among the three brother kings addressed issues that affected multiple domains, while maintaining the autonomy that each ruler required for effective governance of his particular sphere. These discussions established patterns for diplomatic cooperation that influenced both immortal politics and human international relations throughout the classical period. Seasonal assemblies brought together representatives from all divine factions to address concerns that required collective action while preserving individual authority within established spheres of influence. The Sky Lord's role as moderator during these gatherings demonstrated leadership skills that emphasized facilitation rather than domination, building consensus rather than imposing decisions through superior might. Temple worship throughout the Mediterranean world reflected local variations in architectural style and ceremonial practice, while maintaining consistency in fundamental principles that connected diverse communities through shared acknowledgement of cosmic authority. These institutions served both religious and civic functions, providing frameworks for community organization that transcended purely political arrangements. Sacrificial protocols developed sophisticated systems for communicating with heavenly authority, while demonstrating proper respect for the relationship between mortal supplicants and immortal benefactors. The smoke that rose from burning offerings carried prayers and promises skyward, while creating visible connections between earthly concerns and celestial oversight. Priestly hierarchies evolved to serve increasingly complex religious needs, while maintaining traditions that preserved essential knowledge about proper worship and divine nature. These organizations provided career paths for individuals whose talents suited them for religious service, while ensuring that specialized knowledge remained available for communities that required guidance about spiritual matters. Festival calendars coordinated celebrations that honored celestial authority, while providing opportunities for community bonding that strengthened social fabric through shared experiences of joy and reverence. These events demonstrated that religion could enhance rather than constrain human happiness when properly understood and appropriately practiced. Unlike other deities, whose myths included stories of death, defeat, or replacement by successor generations, the Thunder King remained constant throughout the changing ages that transformed mortal civilizations while preserving essential features of cosmic order. His reign represented not mere temporary dominance, but permanent establishment of principles that would continue operating regardless of political upheavals or cultural transformations. Mythological frameworks that developed around his figure provided structures that enabled storytellers throughout subsequent centuries to explore fundamental questions about authority, justice, family relationships, and the proper ordering of existence according to principles that served both individual fulfillment and collective welfare. These narratives became vehicles for transmitting wisdom across generational boundaries, while adapting ancient insights to address contemporary concerns. His legacy transcended simple historical influence to become the gravitational center around which all other mythological traditions arranged themselves, providing reference points that enabled diverse cultures to understand their own stories within larger contexts that connected local experiences to universal patterns. Every tale of heroism, every exploration of divine nature, every attempt to understand humanity's place within cosmic order bore traces of insights that had emerged through contemplation of the Sky Lord's character and achievements. Educational systems that emerged throughout the classical world use stories about the King of Heaven and his fellow Olympians to transmit cultural values while developing intellectual capabilities that enabled students to think critically about complex moral and philosophical questions. These pedagogical approaches demonstrated that mythology could serve rational purposes while preserving emotional and spiritual dimensions that purely abstract reasoning could never adequately address. Standing eternal upon his celestial throne, the ruler embodied permanence within change, constancy within transformation, and justice within might that might otherwise become mere tyranny. His reign had survived every test that cosmic forces could devise, while establishing foundations that would support human civilization throughout its greatest achievements and most difficult challenges. From his palace windows, the King of Gods could observe cycles of rise and decline that affected all earthly arrangements while remaining confident that essential principles would survive temporary setbacks to emerge stronger and wiser through experience gained in struggle. Empires would fall, languages would disappear, and entire civilizations would be forgotten. Yet the ideals that the eternal reign had established would continue inspiring those who sought to build rather than destroy, to serve rather than exploit, to create rather than consume. His thunderbolt remained ready to defend justice against any challenge, while his wisdom continued growing through observations of countless variations on eternal themes that played out across the endless theater of existence. He was not merely a god. He was the sky, the storm, the law, and he would outlast them all, eternal witness to creation's unfolding drama, whose ultimate meaning lay not in any particular episode, but in the accumulated testimony that consciousness could triumph over chaos, that purpose could emerge from randomness, and that love could find expression even within the constraints that cosmic justice necessarily imposed upon unbridled desire. The voice that had spoken creation into order continued echoing through dimensions both visible and hidden, its resonance ensuring that as long as existence itself continued, the principles of justice, wisdom, and benevolent authority that the eternal king embodied would remain available to guide those who possessed sufficient courage and insight to hear their call above the noise of temporary concerns and passing fashions that might otherwise obscure eternal truths about the proper relationship between strength and responsibility, between freedom and law, between individual will and cosmic purpose.